Oh boy, the 5090 is in the house. Big thanks to NVIDIA for sending me a 5090 a little bit ahead of time so that I could take a look and poke at it and run things and try to understand this mighty 600 watt beast. There's a lot we have to talk about, and not all of it has to do with gaming. A lot of it has to do with AI, but some of it actually has to do with AI and gaming and frame generation, because a lot of the excitement from CES has to do with frame generation. But a lot of people are curious, well, wait a minute, what about without frame generation? 32 gigs of VRAM. Let's unpack, dive in, whatever. I think this is going to be a controversial GPU family in general. The 5090 is probably going to be the least controversial member of that family, but 32 gigs of VRAM, a ridiculous amount of horsepower. We'll go over the physical specifications of that in just a minute. But the hook is, wait a minute, if you compare apples to apples, this is not actually more power efficient than last generation. But it turns out that that might not actually be important at all to a lot of people because it's a desktop computer. So yeah, I mean, another 125 watts over the 4090, maybe is not important. Not sure about that. The other thing that's going to be a big controversy is frame generation. Is frame generation a real technology? Is this a legit way to do this? NVIDIA has bet big, and they think, yes, that is the answer. But we'll talk more about that as the review evolves. Or unwinds. Unspools probably is the better word there. Let's talk physical specifications first. For most of our testing, we use this Falcon Northwest Tiki 9800X3D based system. It was configured with Expo DDR5 6000, resized bar was on, and we were on Windows 11 24H2. Additionally, if you follow this channel, you know that there's a number of tweaks that we make to Windows 11 24H2 for best performance, especially on the AMD platform, but just because, the operating system and everything else. We also enable hardware accelerated GPU scheduling, as this is a recommendation from NVIDIA for DLSS 3 and DLSS 4 workloads. The fact that a 5090 fits in here and works fine, this is an insanely screaming fast configuration from Falcon Northwest. You couldn't do it with a 4090, but now you can with a 5090 thanks to the double flow through design. That works really well for getting rid of heat. It's 150 watts more. The 5090 uses more power than a 4090, and yet it runs cooler. Let's talk noise and thermals. For a detailed noise and thermals analysis, you probably should check out Steve from Gamers Nexus. For me, in the Falcon Northwest Tiki, it's subjective. It's like, can I tolerate this sitting on the desk? And the answer is yes, because at idle, you can't really hear it. It's barely audible. And when I'm playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, even though it's got a bug where I can't put down a screwdriver, which is really frustrating because I'm going to have to roll back over an hour in order to get to a save from before that happened, you can hear the sound of air movement, but it is not annoyingly loud or whiny or anything else. And the fact that they're able to do that in this tiny case in 2U is something you literally couldn't do with a 4090. So that's darn impressive. And in case you're curious about the Falcon Northwest specific thermals and Furmark results, well, here they are. Very impressive. Very impressive build. It's the dual flow through design. 600 watt card, and they're able to do that. In this tiny little package. Mind blowing. We've also validated the results from this system on an open test bench configuration. That was also a 9800X3D based system, and we also did limited testing on a Core Ultra 9 285K based system with the Q1 2025, January 2025 updates to the Intel platform. Generally, the gaming performance on this system is fantastic, and the Core Ultra 2 system was not quite as good, and there's a couple places where that might make a difference. We'll call that out unless it gets trimmed because this review is running kind of long anyway. This card, the 5090, apart from all of the other 5000 series cards, is the card in this generation. It is truly an upgrade. All the other 5000 series cards depend on AI to do their magic. And when Jensen said the 5070 can deliver performance like a 4090, wasn't that what he said on stage? Cut to the clip.
With the Blackwell family, RTX 5070, 4090 performance.
He means with upscaling and frame generation features. The AI stuff, the AI special sauce.
Impossible without artificial intelligence. Impossible without 4 teraops of AI tensor cores. Impossible without the G7 memories.
This card gives you that. But on top of that, the most significant and real, I think, generational improvements that are going to come in the 5000 series are almost all in the 5090. Period. This card gives you significantly more VRAM, 32 gigabytes, which is important for AI and AI type stuff for sure. For gaming, NVIDIA says it's not as important anymore, but this card also piles on the AI features, so we still need it for that. They have RTX neural shaders and RTX neural faces. This, NVIDIA says, reduces the demand on the GPU video memory for top-notch textures. And I've been playing a lot of games the last 4 days. Still, the 5090 bumps both of the amounts of VRAM or both the metrics. I mean, the amount of VRAM and the speed, GDDR7. The memory benchmarks are about 80% faster in my testing, which was kind of face melting. Like GDDR7 is as fast as HBM from when HBM first showed up on the scene, which is kind of wild. So, yeah, fun times. If you don't take anything else away from this review, you need to understand the big picture with gaming and frame generation and RTX textures and neural textures. The biggest bet that NVIDIA has ever made with gamers is in this generation. And probably the biggest potential for backlash, gamer backlash, is high. The AI people don't care. Their AI people are going to be super happy. And we'll talk about all of this, but first let me show you. As I tell you about all the wonder and magic that is the 5090, I want you in your mind to think about it as native rendering features, gen-on-gen improvement, like everything the 4090 can do. What did the 5090 improve? And then I want you to also think about it in terms of the AI features, because a lot of what you've already seen pre-launch coverage from NVIDIA and CES and a lot of the wonder and magic from that presentation and all of the data that has been, trickled out over the last couple of days is around the new AI functions and AI functions that improve gaming, not just AI for machine learning enthusiasts. This generation is all about DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation, AI upscaling, neural textures, RTX magic, and some of these features are exclusive to this generation, the 5000 series GPUs, but not everything. Some things will actually work on a 4090, 4080, somewhere through there. As Hardware Unboxed says, this is really a smoothing technology when we're talking about frame generation. And for me, it's about the overall gameplay experience. Is the overall gameplay experience better? Do I get better visual fidelity, smooth gameplay, less hitching? NVIDIA is keenly aware that they can't just slap on frame generation and expect everybody to just use it. At the same time, NVIDIA has lots and lots and lots of telemetry about how long you play, what games, and at what settings. 80% of gamers on NVIDIA are using DLSS today. Right now, it's DLSS 3, 3.5, somewhere through there. And they know that because they have that from the driver telemetry. And that's very important. Now, everybody knows that frame generation adds latency. But NVIDIA is taking a lot of steps in the design to minimize that as part of Reflex 2. And for my own testing, I can tell you, Reflex 2, it's like just the improvements in the 5000 series in general and frame gen is hugely impressive. And I'm kind of a skeptic. I'm like actually kind of I haven't been super enthusiastic about DLSS technology in the past. If you want the lowest possible latency, sure, you're going to have to use native technology. But NVIDIA has done what they've done well, and the results that I've experienced are actually very good. The other thing is image quality and fine details in DLSS 4 show the most improvement over DLSS 3 and 3.5. With DLSS 3, things like a chain link fence in Cyberpunk, they get that right some of the time, but not all of the time. A lot of the detail and textures would get a little mixed up. You get shimmering, maybe some weird animation artifacts. I mean, okay, but that's when you'd really notice that you were using some kind of AI technology as opposed to just native rendering because something weird was happening, across games. Now with DLSS 4, not so much. DLSS 4 impresses me, and that's saying something. I'm surprised that it is as good as it is. NVIDIA says they've dumped millions upon millions of dollars in it, and I kind of believe it after playing with it. If you got a 5090, you wouldn't think that you'd need to rely on these kinds of technologies, but, you kind of do. And its efficacy will vary from game to game, but as a smoothing technology, it has helped, as far as I can tell, and helped in a way that it hasn't on previous generations. And I don't think that I'm describing really a smoothing technology. Describing it as smoothing doesn't really do it justice when you experience it. This is NVIDIA's big bet. This is the one where there may be gamer backlash. But remember, gamers have been using this tech 80% of the time. So let me share with you this important bit from the reviewer guide. This is verbatim from NVIDIA. When GeForce RTX 50 series graphics cards hit store shelves, GeForce RTX 50 series gamers will be able to multiply performance with DLSS multi-frame generation in 75 games and apps, and all GeForce RTX users will be able to experience the new transformer-based DLSS ray reconstruction, DLSS super resolution, and DLAA in over 50 games and apps. 2. For many games that haven't updated yet to the latest DLSS models and features, the NVIDIA app will enable support through a new DLSS override feature. Alongside the launch of our RTX or GeForce RTX 50 series GPUs after the installation of a new GeForce Game Ready driver and the latest Marvel Rivals and Dragon Age the Veilguard. At launch, gamers will have access to 75 supported DLSS override titles. Now, the actual launch where you can buy a card is in another week or so. So this is something I'll be revisiting. These titles that I've been able to test for this video are the absolute best possible case put forward by NVIDIA for all these new technologies. So I think because of that, you have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, which is why I shared that with you. As for other games like Cyberpunk 2077, Alan Wake 2, etc., I have access to the beta versions of those games. And those games add support for these technologies natively. So I don't need the NVIDIA app to override what the game is doing and set it in the app. I can just set it in the game. So it's not like I only tested 2 games. I'm just letting you know that there's more, and the efficacy and how good it is in other games is probably going to be variable. Multi-frame generation is a 50 series feature only. So, well, actually a lot of these features rely on the AI stuff and advanced driver features of the card. And remember when the driver update a few weeks ago hurt performance when the app was installed? Now we kind of know why on 40 series. But, consider for a second that this could be a source of big drama depending on how bigger channels spin the AI features and upscaling and gen-on-gen uplift. It's that whole AI context versus, traditional GPU functionality context. There's 2 different things going on this one card. Cyberpunk 5090, no upscaling, none of that going on. I'm outside. It's not the built-in benchmark, 54 FPS. I'm tooling around 2.5 gigahertz GPU frequency. This isn't bad. I mean, this is a significant uplift over the 4090, but it's not 384 FPS. And if we look at our kilowatt, we see that the system is using about 720 watts. Now, let me change this to enable DLSS and frame scaling, get to that glorious 364 FPS, but we want to look at the power utilization. This is just the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, but I've restarted the game. 220 FPS, but we're using about 100 watts less on the kilowatt. The GPU is actually doing less work. But more importantly, this is only a 120 hertz monitor. We're rendering frames that it's really not going to make sense to look at. All right, so with my target of 120 FPS dialed in Cyberpunk, now my GPU is only using about 450 watts, 370 watts less. Here's the thing though. I would like for the GPU to render as many real frames as possible and then make up the difference to get me to 120 FPS using frame generation. And there's not really a way to do that as far as I can tell, at least with Cyberpunk and most of the games that I tested. I would much prefer to use frames rendered by the game, more of those, and less of the ones that are created using the real frames in the game. There's not really a way to do that. This is always going to err on the side of frame generation, which uses less power overall. So when I've got a setup that exactly matches my super fancy pants monitor, 4K 120 hertz, the GPU is going to use less power. And I'm going to get more AI generated frames than real frames. I would like it the other way around. I think that's reasonable. There should be a way to do that. And there probably will be if enough people notice that and complain. But just thought I'd share. Okay, so to really emphasize what's going on there with Cyberpunk, with what I was trying to show you. As a gamer, I've got my fancy pants monitor. I want to experience native performance as close as I can and rely on AI and frame gen only when I really need it. So if my card can do 100 FPS and I've got 120 FPS monitor, I'd like native rendering, for 100 hertz. I mean, I can get my fancy 120 hertz display to be at 120 hertz all the time, or I can, rely on FreeSync to just, it's about 100 hertz. Okay, that's fine. When I turn this on for frame gen, I can tell that the card's actually using significantly less power. It's actually running at about 60 hertz and doubling that to 120 hertz for 4K. It uses a lot less power. It's way more power efficient in that respect, but I'm getting way less natively rendered frames than what I would get with the frame generation turned off. It's just a little too slow for my monitor. I want it to be a little faster. And I think gamers might not like that. I think gamers want to get as many natively rendered frames as possible, and frame gen can make up the difference. But we can see that that's not happening currently because of the power usage of the card. Now, I can fiddle with it maybe and do the settings and get it to behave more like I want, but it doesn't really natively think that way. It's like, 60 hertz natively, multi-frame gen. Or you could do multi-frame gen again, another level, and go from 60 to 240. I mean, natively, it's true that the higher your native frame rate, the better off you're going to be with multi-frame generation technologies, because I guarantee you the difference between 120 and 240 hertz, those generated frames, you don't have a lot of wall clock time there to see that frame. And if half of the frames are real and half of them are AI generated, you don't really know. But from my own personal experience, half of them, or a third of them, or a quarter of them being real, and the other ones being AI generated, it was really hard to tell. In a lot of cases, the AI generated frames looked better than the real frames from the game because, the game. When you think about the 5090 and its position and behemoth-like qualities, it can punch through the traditional stuff, but also do the AI stuff, and so it's sort of the best of both worlds here. But it's not just frame generation. NVIDIA also has the neural compression and textures and neural rendering for people to make everything a little bit more lifelike. It can recreate a lot of complexity and complexity that shows up in detailed textures without actually having the large detailed textures, which take up a lot of VRAM. And so that's what NVIDIA means when they say, you don't really need as much VRAM anymore. That's also why the 5090 is kind of the best card in this generation. Again, it's got a ridiculous amount of VRAM. So if you do want to put yourself in a situation where you're loading ungodly textures and you don't want to use the RTX compression features, you have the VRAM to do it, or AI functions or anything else. It's just other cards farther down the stack, you might not have the option. And so, like the 5070. The 5070, for example, is way more going to lean on the AI features and everything else, at least I think it does. So if you game with a 5070, you'll have a lot of these AI features that I'm describing, and I don't think you're going to have a bad gaming experience with those. But my suspicion is that the non-AI features, just the raster stuff, the stuff in the other column, you're not going to see as much uplift gen on gen from 4000 series or other competing products. The other thing I worry about here is when you use advanced software features at the same time as you want to play a game. So like the NVIDIA Broadcast software, which we'll talk about in just a second, which is actually it's mind-blowingly cool. You're going to have to make sure that you got enough headroom on your card to juggle the gaming workload as well as the AI stuff. And it seems like the frame generation stuff really frees up a lot of headroom on your card to be able to do all this other stuff. There's even a warning in the NVIDIA Broadcast Setup Guide that you need at least a 5080 for the highest end features for streamers. Now, there's a video on NVIDIA Broadcast that you should definitely watch because it's mind-blowing. And that was a more advanced version of the new NVIDIA Broadcast software than I had access to for this review. But NVIDIA's big bet here is that gamers will be happy with a lower-end GPU that has less VRAM and less transistors allocated toward the native rendering stuff that historically has gone into GPUs. And more of the transistors and features and technology is going to be allocated for these AI features under the AI umbrella. Not for like large language models and image generation, although you can use it for that, but these gaming features. And as they're demonstrating here, they're getting a much bigger gaming bang for the buck, or bang, in terms of how many FPS did you get per transistor and, unit resource that went into the GPU versus how much you get from native rendering and scaling native rendering. The 5090, 80% faster memory, 30% more card, but at 30% more power, 30% faster overall in those raster tasks, while being 2.5 to 3.5 times faster for literally everything else AI related. The CUDA performance is breathtaking. We'll talk about that too, don't worry. I don't necessarily see the frame generation and the AI stuff as a bad thing. The fly in the ointment is always going to be the latency part of that, but, maybe the visual fidelity a little bit, the little visual artifacting things, shimmering, other types of the little weird side effects that can come from essentially, a smoothing or interpolation technology, if you will. Interpolation technologies are not in and of themselves bad. Fourier transformations facilitate a lot of interpolation for computation and other computing contexts. So finding a way to do fast, high fidelity approximation in a gaming context, 80% of people so far don't have a problem with this, or at least they don't seem to based on usage. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the conclusion though. Let's take a look at the actual benchmarks, the actual gaming stuff, because I've rambled about this long enough. With this, native performance uplift versus AI performance uplift, that's what I want you to keep in the back of your mind. It's like, is this because they've improved the gaming, the pure old school gaming part of it, or is this because of the gee whiz new AI features? Because there's two columns there. First up, Cyberpunk 2077. And an apples to apples comparison, 4090 versus 5090. It's a 34 FPS versus 59 FPS battle. I mean, it's really not super impressive. But you turn on the AI features and oh boy, at this one particular freeze frame during the canned benchmark, 61 FPS versus 472. Yes, but let's look at the detail. Look at the water on the sidewalk and look at the fine detail in the soda machine. A DLSS 4 on, it looks like it picks up some of the fine detail, and the filtering, neural algorithm, whatever, actually makes it a little bit more well-defined. But you lose some detail in the water. Now DLSS 4 off for the water that's up here I think looks a little better, but the water down here doesn't look quite as good. Whereas with DLSS 4 on, the water down here looks a little better, but the details here are a little bit more muted. It's interesting. It's very, very interesting. You notice little things like that. Now, in terms of real motion gameplay, DLSS 4 on, pretty satisfying. Especially on that oily D monitor. OLED. One of the things I always love to look for when we're talking about AI frame gen is lighting and shadows, and Cyberpunk provides tons of opportunities for that. There's still jittery shadows a little bit, but this is really, really subtle, and you have to be looking for this, and this is a night and day improvement over a DLSS 3, so this is a huge engineering win for NVIDIA that this works as well as it does. The main caveat here is that, okay, the canned benchmark is not really representative of overall Cyberpunk performance. And again, if I've got a 120 or a 240 hertz display, I would like for as many of these frames as possible to be real. And it's not a fine grain enough control to set, frame gen 2x or frame gen 3x. If I set frame gen 3x, then I'm topping out the capabilities of my monitor, but the GPU could be generating more normal frames as opposed to AI generated frames, which may lead to a better gaming experience. I'm just not sure about that. Star Wars Outlaws was another title that NVIDIA was keen to show, and I can see why. It looks really, really good, and it runs buttery smooth. It runs smoother than I have ever experienced. I have not logged a lot of time in this game, unlike Cyberpunk, but it is really, really good performance with FSR 4. FSR 4 is shockingly good in this title. You can kind of look at our outdoor scene here with running and see some mild reflections on the texture on the ground and some lighting effects. And this seems to look better with the AI effects than without, even though, it's sort of wild. So let's take a closer look at a multi-game roundup. 4K highest preset, ray tracing on, DLSS off, and frame gen off. Now the highest preset is not like Psycho in Cyberpunk, just to be clear, but Dragon Age Valgard, Cyberpunk 2077, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Star Wars Outlaws. This doesn't look amazing. It's like 4K highest preset. I can only get 18 FPS in Alan Wake 2. I can only get 27 FPS in Star Wars Outlaws. I mean, this is a pretty significant generational uplift. 71 to 106 FPS in Hogwarts. That's reasonable. 88 to 125 FPS in Marvel Rivals. Okay. Dragon Age Veilguard. 50 to 73 FPS. Okay. I mean, yeah, that's pretty good. Almost 60 FPS in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. That's almost entirely playable. So with average FPS, highest preset, ray tracing on, DLSS performance, and frame gen off, okay, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, we're starting to see something here. And remember, this is a beta branch of Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty. Marvel Rivals of 141 to 175, 125 to 145. And this is, remember, you get the 2X, you get some generational uplift. So this is a new driver and new software and everything else. So this makes it look like the difference between the 4090 and the 5090 is not quite as much as it is because the 4090 is taking advantage of some of the new software here. And so a couple of weeks ago with an older driver version, maybe some of these numbers were not quite as in line. But then there comes frame generation. Yeah, this is where things get a little insane because remember the 5000 series can deal with it 3x, 4x, etc. So 248 versus 451 FPS in Hogwarts, 218 versus 446 in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, 160 versus 446. Yeah, it's just, and everything that I tried, I've also logged a lot of hours in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and that has some breathtaking visuals. It's kind of a lot of fun. That is a more fun game to play than Crystal Skull was to watch. This is a very, very enjoyable experience. Star Wars Outlaws, 107 versus 243 FPS. This is sort of nuts. Geekbench 6 should get us a little bit more grounded in reality. That's going to be less on the AI column and more in the traditional uplift column. And it's about 15% faster over the 4090. NVIDIA's DLSS test in 3D Mark, well, it's 181% faster because DLSS on, but 30% faster with DLSS off. And it's really interesting how much 30% comes up in this review. 30% faster, 30% more power, 70% more memory bandwidth, 30% more transistors. I mean, 30% shows up a lot in this review. Port Royal, 42.1%, 30%, and then some. That's 30% plus 12%. I'll take it. Procyon is a useful AI benchmark, and for the canned Procyon benchmarks, yes, we're talking 18%, 32%, 28%, 34%. It's right around 30%. Tokens per second, 30%, 45%, 50%. Depending on if your model can take advantage of the new, Int 8 stuff, you can get a 2.5 times speed up, which is also sort of crazy. Now, Puget Bench, 8.1%. You get an 8.1% generational uplift in Puget Premiere. I don't think Premiere and Photoshop have really been updated to deal with the new hardware. Maybe we have to wait on a like a creator driver, but I wouldn't hold my breath on this part of it getting dramatically better. Yes, we did add billions more transistors from the 4090 to the 5090, but almost all of those have been on the AI side of the equation. Now for these canned AI benchmarks, I had my own AI stuff that I wanted to run. I'm not able to run Linux yet because there's not native Linux drivers, but I can run Ollama and deal with CUDA on Windows because we got a lot more CUDA cores in the 5090 than we had on the 4090. Quick note on the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. It's very hard to accurately get the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows because you pretty much have to use NVIDIA's tools to collect that right now. Other tools like PresentMon are not really going to work correctly out of the box, and it's sort of more complicated than I expected. So I have omitted some of that data for this video. For the no frame gen, no upscaling, no anything else, comparing the 4090 1% and 0.1% lows to the 5090 0.1% and 1% lows, the 5090 was at least no worse than the 4090. If anything, it was better, but again, not really the point of this particular review, and after we've got better tools for looking at the 0.1% and 1% lows, maybe that's something I can revisit. You have to check out NVIDIA's broadcast video, the video about where broadcast is coming, because the version I have access to is not all there yet. It's an AI virtual assistant that is absolutely unhinged. What I got access to was Virtual Keylight and Studio Voice. Those are interesting, and they're more likely to be used in just about any scenario. They were actually very impressive, especially combined with like using a DSLR as a webcam so that it gets enough detail for low light on your face. You don't have to have a blinding light in your face. It can just make it look like you're lighted, which is amazing. Studio Voice was able to filter out this dual 192 core EPYC server from the background. That's neat. And Keylight, okay, Keylight's cool, but you take a lot of GPU horsepower. So like I was saying earlier, it might compete a little bit with your game, but it's a really neat effect. And I think that a lot of streamers are probably going to use this. I don't personally like having a bright light in my face when I'm streaming a game, trying to unwind, just hanging out, doing fun stuff. And so this was a really neat feature for me. The AI Stream Assistant thing in NVIDIA's own video about what's coming with broadcast, they say in February, was much more mind-blowing. And that software, while it wasn't ready yet for this video, should be out soon. I'm sure it's the NVIDIA Maxine team, the Maxine SDKs and everything else are absolutely unhinged. And so this feels like that level of unhinged in the best possible way. I'm sure they're using that for the heavy lifting on this feature. NVIDIA could probably sell a subscription to a Stream Assistant that is as intelligent as what they've demoed here. It's wild. And, you know, if you're paying for a $2,000 card like this, you'd better be using the AI capabilities, right? I mean, far and away for me, that is the biggest justification for having a graphics card that costs more than most people spend on their entire computer. Gosh, it really does feel like living in the future, though. So there you go. NVIDIA is changing the game literally and figuratively. If you want 200 FPS at 4K, you're going to have to lean into frame generation. Not just upscaling, not just anything else. It's a blessing. It's a curse. Is it a mere smoothing technology? Or is it more like using a Fourier transform as an approximation? Which, you know, is entirely reasonable and widely accepted approach for things that applies to. I have a hunch that for high-end cards like this, it's fine. There's no denying the engineering prowess to dissipate 600 watts of heat in a 2U configuration with just 2 fans. I mean, that's nuts. I mean, it's over a larger area of silicon. That helps versus, you know, a tiny little piece of silicon. But the 2-slot dual flow-through design really is incredible. This card is casually dumping 600 watts of heat into your case, or in my case, into the room. And that is sort of something. The source of the heat is, you know, that half acre of silicon underneath the middle part of the heatsink on that card. That means the source of the heat is a little bit more diffuse, larger area, and so it's easier to cool, sort of. But it's still an engineering accomplishment. This is kind of like the Threadripper of GPUs that we've got going on here because there's so much silicon real estate. But with FrameGen and the gaming stuff that goes with FrameGen and neural rendering and all that sort of stuff, and you target your monitor refresh rate, you could game at 120 FPS plus in 300 to 400 watts too. You're not necessarily sucking back 750 watts for your total system power. What I've learned here makes me worry about the other cards in this generation though, because the 5000 series launch, I mean, it's a foregone conclusion. If you look at the information they've released on the 5070, it's obviously not actually as fast as the 4090, not really. Perhaps that's a lie, but it's a lie in the direction of the truth. I mean, with the 5070, with these new AI features, okay, maybe I would believe that. It can look as fast as a 4090. Maybe. That makes sense, but not natively. And that means most of the resource budget on less expensive cards like the 5070 are going to go into the AI features and not traditional raster performance, traditional gaming performance, in other words. Everything's going to go in that AI column as opposed to the, you know, what you expect for gaming performance column or gaming features. And that's the thing that gamers might react badly to. Or maybe 80% of them won't care and they'll welcome these new features. And the 20% are the loudest 20%. But these features are what you're going to need to lean into to get stellar gaming performance numbers. As for the 5090, it's the real deal, at least as far as I can tell. Even taking into account the fake frame stuff or AI stuff, you know, it doesn't feel terrible when you actually use it. And side by side with my setup here, the best of both worlds, you know, 120 FPS natively versus 240 with FrameGen, or like 100-ish FPS FreeSync, G-Sync with, yeah, it was, I actually think I preferred the FrameGen setup functionality, me personally, for those games. And when you get down to it, for those pure raster tests, well, it's also not really more power efficient either than last generation. A little worse, perhaps. More CUDA cores, clocked a little slower. That's actually more efficient per unit CUDA, barely. But it is a 2-slot card with a 30% higher heat load than the much larger 4090. So, yeah. I mean, those two things, I think, are going to be the controversy of this generation. The power stuff plus frame generation, I think, are the big controversies of this generation of cards from NVIDIA. At lower clock speeds, using the AI functions, it can be more efficient. Like to get to 120 FPS, if you're using FrameGen, it's going to use less power, real world, than a 4090. But like for like, not so much. The power efficiency story is somewhat misleading. Stated another way, 240 FPS in this game at a mere 600 watts versus 43 FPS at 450 watts on the 4090. If we're talking about Cyberpunk. And that's not really a 100% fair comparison. Most of those frames were approximated, so it's really like 43 FPS versus 60 before you get into the frame gen stuff. But if you turn on the frame gen stuff, it actually will use less power and get you to it's madness. It's madness to buy this card just for gaming, but for gaming, game development, and light AI work, well, there's nothing else like it. And there's nothing else like it that you can buy. And for some people, the 32 gigabytes of RAM feature on this card is going to be worth the price of admission at $2,000. Heck, that's going to be a bargain. They'd probably still be interested at $2,500, $3,000. That's just the level of AI FOMO that we're at right now, is people are willing to buy at those kind of prices. If you have a 4090, should you upgrade? Well, you could probably sell your 4090 for $1,000 and then buy a 5090 for $2,000 or maybe $2,500. You're at $1,000, $1,500. That's maybe worth it for gaming and AI and everything else. But gaming by itself, I can hardly believe that a 4090 came out in 2022. That seems like forever ago. If you're just after gaming, even 4K gaming with ray tracing, I think there's going to be bigger bang for the buck alternatives available soon. NVIDIA, the 5070, maybe take NVIDIA at their word. Maybe other things, I don't know. 4090 on the used market, you can buy from the dude that's upgrading to the 5090. I don't know. For me personally, yeah, I'm probably going to buy 2 more. Good Lord, what a card. NVIDIA is going to sell every single one of these cards, and it doesn't matter what gamers think. If you're on Team Frame Gen or you're on Team Fake Frames, it does not matter. These cards are going to be unobtainium for months, probably, because of the other features, if nothing else. I'm not really sure what gamers are going to do. I'm not sure how they're going to take it, but this is a card that can do so much more than gaming. It seems like that it's the best of all worlds in that scenario. So NVIDIA really has done something special here that may kick off a whole new series of things. Or maybe people will be angsty. I don't know. I built this level 1. I'm sure that we have more videos coming on this because there's a lot to cover here, especially when broadcast drops, because the broadcast stream helper thing was just nuts. This is level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the level 1 forums. Let me know what I've missed if you have any questions or what you'd like to see for a fast follow-up video. I didn't get Linux drivers for this in time, so the Linux video for this over on the Linux channel, it's going to be a little while. Sorry, and/or congratulations. All right, I'm signing out and I'll see you there.